Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider our approach to risk and whether it's match fit for the challenges we face in the context of artificial intelligence. Now, normally I interview a thought leader, but today it's just you and me, and no thought leader to join me. And I'm going in a moment to use PowerPoint slides, so I'm departing from our normal format. This gives us the opportunity to share our thoughts, and I do hope that you can use the chat function to let me know any questions and in particular any observations that you may have as we navigate through these issues. And in the first instance, it's always good to hear where you are in the world as you join this event. If I'm not able to get to all of the observations and questions, can I say that I will be gathering them up at the end and using them to the future. So I'm going to talk a little about, a number of things, including the history of thinking and philosophy. The technical term is, I think, epistemology. We're going to be thinking how this links to risk management. We're going to consider artificial intelligence currently, and in particular, what it looks like to the future. I'll touch on human psychology and economics. I'm not a career-long expert in any of these areas, as I'm sure some who join us today will be. But I have an understanding in all, and have been doing research, talking to experts, and I hope bring together a range of thoughts that I'm looking to test today. I'm very keen to hear your thoughts, your observations in response to a thesis I'll be setting out. And the issues are complex, and there's a very real danger that I oversimplify something that is complex, and in doing that I lose important nuance. Nonetheless, I hope I can at the very least introduce some of the issues and register some concerns. So, how are we going to address this over the next 20 or 25 minutes? We'll start by going back 3 centuries to consider how, in the West, Enlightenment introduced us to key principles that underpin our approach to risk today. We'll be exploring what they are. And then, as we consider artificial intelligence, I'll organize around 3 key statements or propositions before illustrating the points with reference to one particular area of risk linked to artificial intelligence. We then return to and test the Enlightenment assumptions. So that's the intention. And we begin by going back those 3 centuries and thinking about the approach to the world, the way in which individuals interacted with the world and reasoned. And this period, certainly in the West, was characterized by fear and uncertainty. And you can see here reference to the divine, to the fated, a strong emphasis on tradition, on omens, portents, on moral accounting. Here, the focus wasn't so much on reason. Things that we take for granted today were in some ways quite alien to the thinking at that time. But we come forward to the Enlightenment period, which of course introduced a range of key concepts like scientific method, the importance of reason, the value of evidence and data, a focus on causality, probability, and a recognition that we can increasingly control the events that go on around us rather than simply being victim to them. That, of course, was 3 centuries ago, but that approach still underpins much of what we're doing today. So I've tried to unpack some of the key elements here. As we moved through the Enlightenment, we gained that sense of human agency, our ability to measure, to anticipate to the future, to understand causal responsibility, and the ability through the scientific method to reproduce the same results again and again. Of course, these are things that we largely take for granted now, and they inform our approach to risk management. And on this slide, for those perhaps listening to this to the future, I've added reference to our current approach to risk management that recognizes that we can identify and evaluate risk. We can express uncertainty objectively and as a number, that bad outcomes have causes that can be controlled, and that we can model our understanding and our approach. For instance, the model that many of us will be familiar with, 3 lines of defense. So that's a very brief reminder of what the Enlightenment brought us. What I'd like to do now is think about artificial intelligence through those propositions that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And the first proposition is that artificial intelligence divides opinion, and importantly, we just don't know what the future holds. It could be so many different developments that we can anticipate. Now, in order to explore this, I simply plucked a number of quotes from global thought leaders in this space. For those that are watching the slides, you'll see that these 6 quotes from Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, a Stanford professor, Geoffrey Hinton, an AI pioneer, Demis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind. These are all very positive. I've highlighted them on this slide. It talks about making life profoundly better, making the world a much better place, adding tremendous value. So these are, of course, encouraging and positive, but equally, there are many quotes that are less positive. Here, again, I've highlighted for those that can see the slide, a number of key observations from Stephen Hawking some years ago, who suggested that this could spell the end of the human race. Elon Musk, whatever we think of him politically, certainly an extraordinary mind. He suggested that we could be summoning the devil. And I particularly like Geoffrey Hinton, the AI pioneer, who suggested that it's like children playing with a bomb. So opinion is divided. But the key thing I think we take from this is that, well, quite simply, we don't know what the future holds. That's my first thesis. But let's move on. And the second is that AI is unimaginably powerful and it is evolving at speed. Well, I don't feel I'm going to be saying anything that comes as a surprise here. It is extraordinarily powerful, and there are many significant drivers that will continue that growth and that power. So we could look at quantum computing, that we know is going to exponentially increase the power of computers and their ability to process data beyond our imagination to a large extent. We could consider neuromorphic and optical computing and the way that that can mimic the brain's structure. The integration with other technologies where AI can complement blockchain, biometrics, robotics, nanotechnology, and so on. And this supported by other drivers outside of technology, for instance, geopolitics, as countries vie for AI supremacy, driven by economic and military ambition. And of course, market forces that drive innovation and drive growth and will continue to accelerate that development in light of all the other factors that I've touched upon. So what can we expect? On this slide, we can see a number of different developments that we can anticipate. For instance, the idea of collective AI or swarm intelligence, where AI capabilities will be able to work together, facilitated by essentially by the internet, where we'll see neuro-AI interfaces. That's already being explored, where there will be literally connection between our brains and AI capabilities. The idea of synthetic consciousness, which of course raises all sorts of philosophical and cultural challenges and some really interesting outcomes. Synthetic conscious we're starting to see, but then looking further down the line, this idea of a godlike ability. Godlike simply because we may not be able to fully comprehend the power of this to the future. So these are some of the things that we can anticipate. What I'd like to do is, in a moment, focus on one area of development in particular to illustrate the profound impact that this could have. There isn't, of course, time to explore all of the potential developments. But before we come to that, some thought around the risk that we face in this space, and in particular, the way and nature of this that is largely unprecedented. So when I look around me, and I'm sure many of those that are joining me today will have found, many of you will have found the same thing, that the conversation around AI risk is very focused on these things that I'm currently showing on the slide. Hallucination, reliability, the risk of model bias, privacy, regulatory risk to the future, and quite rightly, these things are receiving a great deal of attention. And these are areas of risk that we can largely quantify and measure. We can anticipate to the future. So we can apply our traditional risk management techniques in response to them. But there are other risks that are very much more difficult to identify, to evaluate, and therefore to talk about. So, for instance, the unknown nature of AI, looking to the future. The fact that, well, as we were saying before, we just struggle to know what it can look like, how it will develop and evolve in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Other risks, such as security, where AI will amplify, for instance, cyber threats, where autonomous systems may act in a way that is outside of their intention or control. Vulnerabilities that are multiplied by complexity. The potential, for instance, for our systems and our security that is underpinned by encryption models to be unpicked through AI and quantum computing working together. So the security threat is very largely unknown to the future. Increased wealth inequality we can name, and we can start to anticipate, recognizing that those states, those organizations, currently with the wealth and the capital to invest in AI, are likely to be able to accelerate, and that gap between those that have and don't have will increase. A loss of potential control. We're already seeing that some systems are quite apparently, quite cynically and deliberately working outside of the parameters within which they have been deployed. A concentration of power which links to increased wealth inequality, which I mentioned before. And then we come to several other areas that we can group together in terms of the impact of AI on human beings. Unemployment, cognitive surrender, a loss of human purpose. We're going to come on to think about those in a moment. But before we do, for those that can't see the slides that I'm looking at, what I've tried to do is plot these risks on that traditional risk evaluation approach, which is, of course, likelihood and impact. The ones that we were talking about before, we can plot. Hallucination, reliability, model bias. These are things that we can measure and anticipate to a large extent. But these other risks, the unknown, the loss of control, the concentration of power, cognitive atrophy, these are much more difficult to plot, to anticipate. But if we could, then it's reasonable to anticipate that they would be of an entirely different order, a different magnitude of risk to the ones that we're currently addressing. So, I'm going to spend just a few minutes then unpacking one area of risk. And the main reason I'm doing this is just to illustrate the impact that this can potentially have to the future, and to ask the question, have we really understood what this means for us, what this means for our organization, what this means for society, for our culture? So, human capabilities. You may be very familiar with the regular reference that we see to the importance of human capabilities that AI simply can't replace. I often see articles on LinkedIn or in various media around the types of skills that AI simply can't do. And there's a sort of tone of this, a reassuring tone that really we have very little to worry about. And these are the areas showing on this slide that are suggested. So inspiration and communication, empathy, collaboration, psychological safety, mentoring and coaching, nuanced decision-making, conflict management, storytelling. These were suggested in an article that was published in January of 2025, Emerging Trends in Digital Transformation, where the author was suggesting that these are the areas that we will always need people to do. Now, in the last 12 months, since that article was published, we've already seen that many of these areas are actively being addressed and met by AI solutions. And those that aren't, so empathy and collaboration, for instance, we might say, well, how can AI empathize? Because it can't feel. But I think there's a very real danger here that we confuse the activity that empathy gives rise to with the feeling of empathy itself. The computer may not be able to feel empathy, but it can absolutely display it. And there's an argument to show that it can already do that to a higher quality and to a deeper level than human beings are able to. Let me give you an example. That gut instinct that we might have that someone is upset or lying to us, that we can relate to them in a certain way. We can make judgments around them that we can't necessarily define. You might say, well, how could an AI solution match that? But when you pause and think about it, what we're seeing as human beings is those micro movements, a slight dilation of the pupil, maybe a slight sheen of sweat, a tremble in the voice, a change in cadence. And all of these, whether consciously or not, we're able to put together and make judgments around that person's state of mind. And that can feel like instinct. But a computer can measure all of those things, and arguably can reproduce that understanding in a way that is far more scientific, is far more precise, and make judgments around that. Now, I don't want to argue that, and you may disagree with it, but I think the key thing is to recognize that there's a very real danger that we confuse some skills that we suggest only human beings can display with actually the ability of a computer to do the same thing but in a different way. So someone has said there's a very real danger that we allow human value in the workplace to be defined by what AI cannot do. And as we do that, we become hostage to AI not developing any further than it has already. But of course, we've already seen that AI is developing, and that will continue. So AI skills. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but I think we can reflect that AI skills are growing and at pace across a number of different areas, driven by software innovation, quantum computing, scaling laws, investment, growth, all those things that we were speaking about. We see AI growing in skills. But what about human beings? What's happening to human skills in the light of the deployment of AI? Well, this report that we can see on this slide is published by KPMG. It was some research undertaken in Australia, and it considers the impact of AI on human beings in the workplace. There's some fascinating insights contained within it, but the one for me that stood out was that this, published in 2025, some months ago, already 42% of those interviewed said that they were relying on AI to do a task rather than learning how to do it themselves. Now, I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that, but it's worth just unpicking and considering just exactly what's going on. And I'm very grateful to Paul Eccleston, who's a psychologist and an AI expert, who's helped me to understand this. What we can see within the human brain is, and I didn't know this until recently, but apparently 20% of all our energy use is through cognitive effort. Our brains are expensive in terms of energy. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we become cognitive misers. We're very careful about where we spend our energy, where we spend our focus, how we commit to making judgments. And where we can, we will offload. Now, that's not to say we're being lazy. What this is saying is that it's natural that we will do that because our thinking, the hard thinking, is so energy expensive. That cognitive offloading in time will lead to a loss of skills. That, I think, stands to reason because we will stop doing things that AI can do for us. And that, in time, can lead to what Paul describes as cognitive surrender. Cognitive surrender, where we actually reach a point where we think there's not even any point trying because the AI solutions that we can rely upon does the thinking for us. We've literally surrendered that. And with that, our ability to think critically, and in time, of course, that will have an impact on our employment. So we see in very simple terms that human skills are likely to diminish. Reduced memory, reduced critical thinking, this idea of a lazy brain, and AI dependence. So if we bring those two together, on this slide we can see that on the one hand, AI skills are growing, but on the other hand, human skills are diminishing. Now we can create a Venn diagram. Arguably, I think we are, give or take, what we can see on this Venn diagram, which is a fairly equal distribution of skills between AI operating at scale, where there's an automation and it can add value through complex analysis and generative capabilities, complemented by human skills, creative and strategic thinking, interpersonal and emotional intelligence. So there's some overlap between these two, but there is broad complementarity. They're complementing each other. But what's going to happen as over time human skills diminish and AI skills grow? So this particular graph suggests where we might be. It's conjecture, but where we might be in 2035, where AI grows considerably and human value diminishes. And who knows, by 2040, it's possible that all human skills will be incorporated, enveloped within what AI can do. And that raises questions that I'm not sure we've really even comprehended. This was illustrated through a book that was published recently, The Single-Handed Unicorn. This is a book that talks about how to create a company worth $1 billion with just one employee. This is something that I understand is a live issue in Silicon Valley in the US at the moment. A lot of thought and a lot of conversations are around how a company can be created with just one employee at this scale. I think it just illustrates that already there is this movement towards technology replacing human effort. I don't have many minutes remaining, and I'm afraid there's little time to answer questions, but I'm very grateful for those that have suggested some observations, and I'll continue to be very grateful for any further observations that are made. But we return to this question of risk, and in particular the opportunity to revisit the Enlightenment mindset. So if you remember, we thought about the implications of the Enlightenment for our current approach to risk management. The fact that we can identify, evaluate, and manage risk. That's our mindset. That we can express uncertainty as a number. That we can anticipate bad outcomes and control them. Well, I think in light of the evolution of AI and the unpredictability that that introduces, we can return to those assumptions. And on this slide, I'm starting to capture the key areas, such as the past and present informs the future, that risks are discrete, reducible, and treatable, that controls are largely static. And if we had longer, we could unpack these. But when you start to break these down and challenge them, I think we see that none of them stand scrutiny in light of the fairly radical level of uncertainty that AI presents us with. This could be expressed on this chart as a governance gap, where we can see AI development exponentially increasing to the future, creating a gap in comparison to institutional time horizons. There are a number of ways, of course, in which this can be expressed. There is this gap, I suggest, in our thinking, and it leaves us vulnerable to the future because we may not be thinking about the way in which AI is developing in quite the right way. But let me finish in the last moments by just briefly recognizing that here all I've done is just highlight one or two areas at speed. I recognize that each of these deserves far more attention, and all we can do is just start to think about the implications to the future. And for me, I think this is the most interesting and exciting part of this. For those of us working within compliance, we've got the opportunity to make a difference in this space. In the first instance, we just need to carry on. We need to continue managing risk in the way that we have learned using the tools that we've developed. But looking a little bit further down the line, I wonder whether there's opportunity to just start testing assumptions that underlie our approach to risk. Maybe simply to raise our horizons and recognize that maybe underneath this, there's a need to adopt a slightly different mindset. Okay, I've moved at some speed through the issues. I'm very grateful to those that have joined this conversation. I'm very grateful for the observations that have been made. I'd love to hear if anybody has any particularly strong views. Please reach out to me either through LinkedIn or through the ICA, and I would be very, very pleased to continue this conversation. But in the meantime, wherever you are, do take care, and again, thank you for joining me.